Hello, everybody. Welcome to our book launch today. I can't see you as of yet, but can't wait to see all of you shortly.
Cool. So yes, hi everyone. My name is Callum Cant. I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of the OII to this book launch. I'm a postdoctoral researcher here at Oxford, working primarily on AI, and I'm incredibly excited today to invite you, to welcome you to this event. We're going to be looking at the new book, Fake AI, Pseudoscience, Snake Oil and Hype. We're joined today by some of the authors of what is, I think, a really fantastic, exciting and important book. A little housekeeping before we start. We're really fortunate that these events have a varied audience with a wide range of views, and we request that the opinions of others are respected in the chat. So for your awareness, this event is being recorded and will be posted to the OII website following the event. Please ask any and all questions using the Q&A tab at any time, and we'll answer these towards the end of the talk. Questions will be visible to all attendees and can be upvoted and commented upon, and we'll endeavour to follow up any unanswered queries. So with that housekeeping out the way, please allow me to introduce the moderator for today's session, Christine Jacobson. Christine, take it away.
Callum, thank you so much for the introduction and for kicking us off. Thank you also so much to the Oxford Internet Institute for hosting this fabulous book launch, Fake AI, Pseudoscience, Snake Oil and Hype. I am very much excited to be hosting you this afternoon. My name is Christine Jacobson. I am a tech ethics researcher and consultant. I am very excited to have this fabulous panel here today. And before introducing the event, the book that we'll be talking about today and our great panelists, thank you for all of you who are joining us today, whether it's afternoon, morning, or evening for you, from wherever you are calling in. So before introducing all the panelists, I don't want to necessarily assume that you all have read the book, even though I can highly encourage you to do so, as it is a fabulous book. And Isabel will be posting shortly a link into the chat function, so you can all see a link to the book in case you haven't read it yet. So for those of you who have it still ahead of you, let me just give you a brief introduction of the book. Then the speakers, I'll be asking some questions, and then I'll be obviously handing over to you so that you can ask the questions that you have come with. So from predicting criminality and to sexual orientation, fake and deeply flawed artificial intelligence is rampant. And I am sure that all of you have seen in the headlines some news or another. So amidst this very feverishly hyped atmosphere of this current time, this book that we're discussing here today interrogates both the rise, but also the fall of AI hype, pseudoscience and snake oil. So what we will be doing today here with the panelists, but also what the book is doing, is to really bring together different perspectives in different voices from across different disciplines and different countries to really draw various connections between the injustices inflicted by some of the AI that we are seeing very present these days. So each chapter draws what really unpacks lazy and harmful assumptions, but also looks at the various applications of artificial intelligence as they were designed as tools and systems, by who they are being used and who they are being applied to, asking some also very existential questions that underpin these discussions around policy and deployment, really thinking through why are there so many pointless, if not even dangerously flawed AI systems. So without further ado, wanting to obviously look into this, I'll be introducing some of the authors of this monograph that will be here with us today. So I'll be starting off with Friederike Kaltheuner, as she is the editor and one of the contributors to this book. She is a tech policy researcher and the director of the Tech and Rights Division at Human Rights Watch. She was previously a Mozilla Tech Policy Fellow, and this book has grown out of this fellowship. We are also joined today by Favor Borocchini, who is a tech policy researcher interested in emerging technology-facilitated violence against women and the development and deployment of AI in Africa. We have with us today as well, Aidan. Hi there, we can see you now. And then we have with us as well, Aidan Pepin, who is a senior researcher at the Ada Lovelace Institute. He researches the relationship between society and technology and brings public voices to ethical issues of data and AI. Then we have also Gemma Milne, who's a Scottish science and technology writer. Hey there, Gemma, and a PhD researcher in science and technology studies at the University College London. Her debut book is Smoke and Mirrors, How Hype Obscures the Future and How to See Past It. I can very much recommend reading that as well and getting that. And then we have with us Tulsi Parida, who works on data solutions for government in the financial sector. Her previous work has been in EdTech with a focus on responsible and inclusive learning solutions. And then last, but certainly not least, Aparna Ashok. So lovely to have you with us as well. She's an anthropologist, service designer, and AI ethics researcher. She specializes in ethical design of automated decision-making systems. It's wonderful to have you all here. Thank you so much for your fantastic contributions. I'll be asking some questions to each of you before then opening it up to our audience today. So Friederike, I wanted to start with you, seeing that you are the editor of the book, and I was hoping that you might give us a little bit of an introduction in terms of like the kind of terms we'll be discussing today, just to make sure we are all on the same page, not wanting to assume that everyone understands quite what you might mean by artificial intelligence or hype or pseudoscience or snake oil. So that's one, if you could give us a brief overview. And then the other question is, I was really keen to understand why it is now in time that you have brought these various concepts together, and why is this book on AI hype so relevant in this very moment?
Thank you so much, Christine, also for the kind introduction. So I'm very excited that we're having this event today, even though it is a strange day to be talking about anything that's not breaking news. So in preparation for this event, I reread my own essay, and there was a sentence that I would like to read to you because it really captures the motivation behind this project. And the sentence is, resisting and protecting people from AI pseudoscience is about more than making AI accountable, explainable, more transparent, and less biased. So when this, I'm just also going to show the book. So when this project was envisioned in 2020, I think we were at the downside of the AI hype cycle. So there were more and more news stories criticizing AI that is biased, that is racist, that is flawed. But at the same time, and at the time I was working a lot with policymakers, my sense was that there are more and more discussions about how to fix AI, but we're still not talking about the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is, and this is the entire framing of this book, is that yes, there are AI systems that are biased, and we need to tackle that. Transparency is an important issue, and yes, we need to tackle that. But beyond this, the broader question is, why is there so much AI that's fundamentally dubious and flawed? And there was a study from a while back that is also cited, I think, in the introduction, that really stuck with me. So a tech journalist looked into the European AI startup scene and really investigated how many European AI startups actually produce AI. And the number was less than half. And it's a funny story. It's embarrassing. It says a lot about the European tech ecosystem. But more importantly, this is a fact that should frame and change the entire policy discussion about AI. So if there isn't actually that much, if AI isn't actually that potent, we need to think very differently about regulation. So this is sort of one of my personal motivations as I'm coming out of the policy field, we need to talk about not just how to make AI better, but also in which areas maybe or probably AI in its current form is completely inappropriate. You asked about the terms. So I think the idea for the original title was AI, pseudoscience, hype, and snake oil. So the title for this panel. And then the publisher pointed out that these are many different terms and they do describe different things, which is true. We do discuss all of these terms in various parts of the book. So I want to give, I will hand it over to Gemma later to explain the term hype. But basically, so snake oil is a term it's not always familiar to people who are not non-English native speakers. It denotes essentially false marketing practices. So you say something is AI, which actually isn't. It's different from hype. Handing it over to Gemma. It's difficult to define hype, but when you're hyping technology, you're exaggerating its abilities to do something. And then there's a category called pseudoscience. So using AI techniques to justify claims in ways that are fundamentally pseudoscientific. And I think what falls very squarely into this category are applications that it's getting better now, but for a while, every other day, at least once a week, there was a breaking news story about an application that squarely falls into the pseudoscientific application. So using AI to detect race, ethnicity is pseudoscientific. So these are some of the key terms we're talking about. It's difficult to write a book about, edit a book about AI when the term itself has become elusive. But I think we're doing two things here. We're talking about the technology itself in some essays, but we're also talking about the discourse and the way in which the term has taken on its own meaning in certain circles.
It's brilliant, Friederike. Thank you so much. And absolutely, Gemma, maybe I'll be just handing over to you because in your article, uses and abuses of hype, and obviously like also in relation to the book that you've written, what I think is fascinating is that you're giving this overview of the culture and the conditions that create hype. So I was wondering whether you could give us a little bit of an overview of those conditions, but also what would need to change in order to address the negative sides of that.
Sure, thanks, Christine, and thanks, Friederike. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, this sort of definition of hype. Everybody, when I was researching my book, and I would ask everyone I was interviewing, you know, how would you define hype? Everybody had a different answer. You know, some people sort of see it as this negative thing that absolutely shouldn't be allowed. Other people see it as exaggerated marketing. Other people see it as sort of fair game PR. Other people say it's just excitement about something that you're doing. So the way I think about hype is it is a form of attention grabbing. That's what it is. That's what it does. And the reason that it's there is because it works. We hear this term bandied about. We live in this attention economy where when you're trying to do something in the world, you're trying to get people to agree with you or join you in something or whatever. You have to be able to grab their attention. You have to be able to gather time for them to focus on what you're saying, and then possibly to then also convince them as well. So it's a form of attention grabbing. And talking about, you said about the conditions in which sort of snake oil and hype and so on and so forth exists. There's sort of three things I touch on in my essay, which maybe I'll just quickly talk about. The first one is that you know, I talked a little bit already about the attention economy, but also about, you know, people are excited about technology broadly. We have the techlash, of course, but when you talk about looking at how technology is covered, how the general public looks to the world of science and technology, it's kind of looking to it for solutions, for interesting ideas, for things that are going to save the world. So if you're going to say things like AI that's going to cure cancer, that there's going to be a relatively receptive and uncritical audience. Not because people are stupid or are uninterested, but because people are time poor, maybe don't feel that it's their place. If they don't wear a white lab coat or did a degree in technology, they might not feel able to criticize or ask questions and so on and so forth. So it pays to put messages out there because they are gathered up by a general public. So that's kind of one element if you're talking about this general audience. The second bit is thinking about what happens within the sort of science and tech sector. And I don't just mean private sector, I also mean public sector, I mean in regulatory circles, I also mean within academia. And that's that hype is needed to operate in this world. All of us who are on this panel, and I'm sure probably most people who are in this audience, know that you need to be able to hype what you're doing in order to get it funded, in order to get people to listen to you. Heck, in order to get people to come to an event, you have to give it a good name. We all know that headlines work in the media, you know, so hype is a lubricant that works in terms of getting your idea to market or into government or whatever it is. So there's a level of complicity in all of us that we utilize hype and trendy areas in order to operate. You know, any researchers in the room know if you put something like AI or, you know, if it was at the moment, I don't know, metaverse or whatever into some kind of funding application, you're going to get people interested in it because it's trendy. It's something that, you know, people want to fund, and kind of doesn't really matter what precisely you're doing. There's an element of capturing attention. So there's a complicity there in the sense that we all utilize it. But the third point, and you talked about culture, and I guess this comes this idea of like, we equate attention with value a lot nowadays, and status is kind of linked to cult of personalities, fame, and so on and so forth, as opposed to tangible social progress. And you only have to look at Elon Musk's Twitter account to know what I'm talking about here. So you asked about what can be done. My piece, I kind of argue that we have to reckon with the fact that hype has positive and negative uses, and that all of us in this sphere probably have to reckon with our own utilization of hype and our own utilization of the trendiness of technology if ultimately we want to be able to tackle hype in general. At the end of the day, if there's opportunity for hype and snake oil, there's going to be opportunists. So we're creating the conditions for it, even just by being here on this panel, arguably.
Gemma, that's absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much for like laying the ground, so to speak, for us to conceptually think about hype and artificial intelligence and how they are fitting together. And what I wanted to do is treat like some of the next chapters, so to speak, as like these instances of that. And so Tulsi and Aparna, I wanted to start with you maybe to think through that excitement, that attention grabbing, that the kind of like hype that is being produced. And you talk in your chapter specifically about about an Indian context, but also farmers' protests in that. And in your contribution, Consolidating Power in the Name of Progress, what I thought was so fascinating is that you introduced this Indian concept of jugaad. Is that how you pronounce it? Great. Okay. And so like you, on the one hand, you say that it is comparable to Silicon Valley's mentality of move fast and break things. And on the other hand, it's also comparable in terms of like the risks that it's posing, especially when brought together with deregulation and the kind of like hype about that technology will solve all things. So what I was curious to see is like, on the one hand, there was this hype, but on the other hand, what you're laying out is that there is a resistance from farmers to this kind of like technology and how it relates to being handled like in a regulatory environment. So looking to you, I was wondering whether you could maybe give us a little bit more of, for those of us in the audience that don't know about the Indian context, what is it that we can learn from India, but also like what is it specifically from Indian farmers that we can learn in the kind of resistance that they're offering to a technology which can turn out to be very harmful and not necessarily benefit the people that is for.
Absolutely, I can start us off. So Aparna and I wrote this in December of 2020. And at that time, the farmers' protests were still fairly new. I think we wrote at the end of our essay that it's uncertain what the outcome will be. And so just to give some context to folks, essentially during the pandemic, the Indian government passed 3 farm laws that was met with a lot of opposition from farmers because in a nutshell, they saw them as being pro-corporate and anti-farmer. So traditionally, farmers are a really protected group. They have a lot of protections around how they can make money, especially as there are a lot of fluctuations in the market. But this move was an active move to deregulate that sector and have more of a free market approach. Since then, the farmers' laws have actually been repealed. So the farmers did win at the end, and it was a huge victory. That we saw this immense block, essentially, of 250 million strong protests that happened, that has then resulted in a win for the farmers. The reason we were really interested in this topic, though, was because the farmers actually made a really interesting connection between their losing these rights and the fact that there was a bigger company out there, or a bigger set of companies out there that were going to be gaining power. And so we started to think about this power imbalance that was kind of coming into play. And one of the companies that they were protesting is actually a massive conglomerate in India that also has a tech arm. And there was a connection between the tech products, the agri-tech products that they were providing, and then their retail sector. And so we tried to make that connection. And our main finding here was that India is much like the rest of the world. There's huge innovation that comes with technology. There's a huge focus in development to use AI to unlock, socioeconomic objectives, et cetera, et cetera. But while in the West, we're seeing now, a growth in privacy protections, data protections for citizens and consumers, in India, that we still don't have a data protection bill that's been passed. And not only is there a lack of regulation, but in certain sectors, there's an active deregulation. And I'll turn it over to Aparna now to talk a little bit more about what that means and what kind of our takeaways from that.
Thanks, Dulcie. And this kind of goes back to this whole idea that not all development is progress, and technology for technology's sake is not always an answer either. Just because you can build something doesn't mean you should be building it. And so India, like many other countries, got really excited by this prospect that there could be a lot of tech innovation within agriculture, but where it started encroaching on rights is in the way it was implemented. So, I love the theme of hype, Gemma. And here again, it was propositioned as a way for agri-tech innovation. However, these claims need to be backed up in how it's implemented in the fine print, in the entire methodology. So if there is something that can be, a universal lesson that can be taken away from how this was handled, is that implementing large-scale automated decision-making systems always puts the power in the hands of the creator. So to do it more fairly would be to co-create with the citizen that would ultimately be impacted by those decisions. And that kind of an approach would have maybe stood true to democratic values, would have seen that proposition of progress really filter through. And maybe that would have gotten a different response from the farmers. That's, they haven't done it, so we don't know how it would really work out. But that would have been a better approach. And that's part of what our findings were, rather maybe more of what we hope is that in the future, whenever there are these promises of technological progress, it won't just be about here are all the magical things that we can create, but anyone who's building these technologies then takes the time and the effort to understand who all it affects, and then bring them into the process of co-creation, because this affects everyone. Part of the reason why I think the farmers were able to get their voice heard is because 58% of India is the agricultural economy, and this timing also overlapped with state elections. So that does have a factor, but hopefully in the future, we just have a different approach to how we build and implement these systems.
That's brilliant. Tulsi and Aparna, thank you so much for giving us, so to speak, like this mini case study of like how it works in India. And I like this idea of what are the kind of like solutions, or what are the things that we can do better in the future, such as choosing a co-creation approach. Favor, I was wondering whether you could maybe talk us through a completely different context, but maybe something where we find some underlying things that are very similar in terms of like the conditions, the problems, and the solutions maybe. So you have contributed with your colleague and friend Ridwan in an article on the process of banking the unbanked in Nigeria, of which there are a staggering 60 million people. So obviously we are talking such as also in the case of India, about very large numbers of people. So you were highlighting some of the risks that are associated with this invasive technology that is currently being created and rolled out. And I was wondering if you could maybe give us a little bit more of a background information to that, but also explain what are some of the key risks, but also what are some of the key steps that we can take in order to counteract these risks as you see them.
Okay, thank you very much, Christine, and thank you so much, Frederica and the Oxford Internet Institute, and everyone who has worked to bring this entire project and this webinar together. So I co-wrote the chapter with my colleague and someone French. It's a huge inspiration to what I currently do with one on the problem of financial inclusion in Nigeria, and how artificial intelligence is being marketed as a solution. So Nigeria is said to be the most populous country in Africa. And there are some statistics that show that this number will only continue to grow. I read once on Twitter that in the next 50 to 100 years, 1 in every maybe 7% would be Yoruba. I think I am Yoruba, of course. So so on the one hand we have a huge population, and on the other hand we have a very young population. So I think the median age for Nigeria is about 17.4 years. So we have a huge number of young people. And then there's also the fact that there are so many people who are unbanked. And what this means is that these people do not have bank accounts with financial institutions. These are people that when you give money to, they probably do not have bank accounts to save it to, or do not see much reason to put their money into banks, because that money is immediately used to purchase food or other necessities. And of course, that entire situation poses the problem of credit. Nigeria does not have much of a credit system the way there is in the US or in countries in Europe and all that. So, so for financial institutions, there's a problem where I think the whole idea of being able to offer credit is, well, there's the fact that it's a huge market for these institutions, and a way of bypassing this barrier, this gap, is by getting access to people through mobile devices. So in Africa, the primary way through which people access the internet is through mobile devices. People access the internet through phones way more than they do laptops or tablets or desktop devices. And Android devices are pretty cheap here, at least the brands that we use compared to other parts of the world. So many forces coming together. And then, of course, financial institutions, new generation financial institutions, the ones that merge technology, with their services, which are fintechs, which are sort of different from traditional banking institutions. Well, they claim to do it out of, they want to improve financial inclusion. So essentially, they offer these services. These services are available through mobile apps because a lot of people have mobile devices. The population is young. Many Nigerians are digital natives, not digital nomads like the older generation. And it's just so much easier to navigate the internet through your phone. So when you download the app, you're able to bypass so many of the problems involved with getting loans from traditional banks. So we've had this huge problem in the past where commercial banks simply refuse to give loans out to people because there are a lot of fears regarding customers absconding with loaned money. And there's also the fact that if they do not have any information about you, it's just really hard to compel people to return money that's borrowed. So with a fintech, the solution that fintechs offer is that once you're able to download this apps on your phone, and customers like that are called thin file customers. So they request access to your contact list, to your messages, to your browser history. They go through your media to see how many selfies you take, what sort of selfies you take, and they use this information to determine if you are a good sort of the person that you would like to loan money to, if you are credit worthy. And based on this information, they then determine how much would be all right to give you. And if they use it to determine risk, basically. We've had some funny situations with certain lend techs who basically, well, if you default on your loan, they send messages to everybody in your contact list that you are a company employee, you are stealing money, or you are HIV positive, or you are a thief, basically, because they've scripted all this data at the moment of installation. So some of the services also offer facial recognition services, and they say that they're able to build trust, verify trustworthiness because of facial recognition that they're able to carry out on customers. And of course, they're using machine learning algorithms to determine all sorts of to build profiles basically and determine all sorts of things about the ideal customer. So of course, there are so many risks involved in this. And I think one major one is innovation for its own sake. And I would say that this is facilitated by Silicon Valley values imported into the country. So the sort of people who are building these apps are people who have born to rich parents, who have trained outside the country, who were educated in the US, in the UK, who have imbibed values about the benefits of digital technology. And some of them want to replicate this in Africa. They want to do it back home. They also, of course, want to make money because these are profit-making institutions. They're not being altruistic alone, at least, even if they say that they are being altruistic. And tech solutionism, the datafying or converting of human beings into data points. And I think that is very dehumanizing in a way that is not often discussed. And then there are, of course, so many risks involved with facial recognition technology. How accurate is it at actually identifying darker skinned people? And also the fact that I think there's some element of phrenology to this. How do you identify if somebody is good or honest based on what they look like? And there's also the fact that so many of these organizations are partnering with the federal government of Nigeria, and they are collecting user data. So in Nigeria, we have 4 important ID systems: the national ID card, the international passport, your voter's card, and your driver's license. So what some of them do is that they pay undisclosed amounts of money to these agencies, and basically they get all this information that you sign to, that you give to the government, and then they pay the government and collect all this data, and then they sell it to other companies who, such as banks or employers of labor, who want to verify customers, who need data points in order to build business algorithms. And do I need to be rounding up anytime soon?
I think like I'll wrap you up soon, because especially what you were saying is like very much leading over to Friederike, the article that you obviously wrote. So Favor, if you want to wrap it up, so I can give Friederike and Aidan an opportunity as well. Okay. That would be great. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, so I'll round up in a minute. So there are, I think that it's problematic that the government is outsourcing its duty. It's the government's role to financially include its citizens. It should not be outsourcing these duties to private companies whose primary interest is to make profit. And then this causes all kinds of breaches to the right to privacy, the right to dignity, and protection from discrimination, and data protection rights, and the opacity behind these machine learning algorithms that these companies consider their intellectual property means that they can't be evaluated. It's not up for discussion at all that you want to conduct data protection assessments on how they are running their business. So there are all kinds of problems regarding this, and I feel that these are solutions. So the solutions to so many of these risks will definitely involve lots more openness in how these businesses are run, and the development of stronger regulation in Nigeria on data protection and human rights protections as well. Thank you.
Absolutely, Favor. Thank you so much. And you obviously showed just like how complex it is and how many layers there are to it. But I think one of the things that you also wonderfully highlighted is this idea that there are all these dangerous assumptions that are being made about people, of who they are, what they are, and how they should be treated as a consequence thereof. Friederike, which obviously brings me to the article that you have contributed in your capacity as a contributor to the book. And in your article, Who Am I as Data, you obviously show how data is dangerously reductionist, and reductionist nearly by necessity. So I was wondering whether you could fill us in what are the stakes really by adopting an approach in which our identities are reduced to data. And before I am asking you to respond to that, I just wanted to remind everyone, if you want to pop in your question already into the Q&A box, then please do so, so that we already know what are some of the questions that we might want to answer. Friederike, over to you.
So there are different levels to this. There's the more philosophical component, and then there's the what does it actually mean in practice. I think I wrote in the text, what's at stake is the question of what does it mean to be a person? And what inspired me to write this, and something I've been thinking for a long time, is we live in a time where a lot of identities have become quite negotiable and moldable. We accept that I can be a different person in 5 years than I am now. It's the entire self-help industry rests on that premise. We also accept that things can change. Your sexual identity can change, your gender can change and evolve. So those are the discourses in which we find ourselves. At the same time, and this is happening in the background, and it's happening in ways that are very opaque, we're increasingly surrounded by systems that classify and rank us. And I love, alternative credit scoring. So the kinds of fintech that Favor just talked about is really an excellent example. What these systems do is, in the absence of traditional banking data, they make an assessment of who you are as a person, how trustworthy you are. we see this in the very pseudoscientific applications of AI that do things like predicting your gender, predicting your sexual orientation. What these applications try to do is they reduce, and it is very reductionist, they reduce the messy reality of what identity is to a system that gives an easy answer. And what I say in this essay is there are circumstances where this is irritating. It can also be discriminatory. An example would be, let's say, online marketing. I'm frequently categorized as a man, which is deeply offensive due to my interest in technology. That's already a problem. But we're also seeing this technology being used in circumstances where decisions are being made about people's livelihood. So at the border, when there's a AI lie detector at the border that assesses whether you're lying or not, this can have devastating consequences. And the absurdity is, or the Kafkaesque nature of this is that when we put faith in these systems, we find ourselves in situations where we have to defend who we are based on assumptions that are being made about us. And I think this is where it gets into what we need to defend here is what it means to be a person. And what it means to be a person means the ability to change, to correct yourself, to evolve. And I think most importantly, especially when it comes to issues like sexual orientation, but also ethnicity, your history, who you are, you should always be the ultimate authority to articulate your identity. And this is something, and again, I think this is where the pseudoscience framing is so crucial. This is something we absolutely should not outsource. It may be statistically possible to calculate the likelihood of someone being one or the other, but it's something we just fundamentally, categorically shouldn't do. And this is sort of the contribution of the collection of essays to the discussion.
That's brilliant, Friederike. Thank you so much about the more like stepping back and thinking about it conceptually and holistically, in addition to these very concrete applications we just heard about. Aidan, and that would bring me to your article, last certainly but not least, about the power of resistance. And in that article, you're drawing a really fascinating parallel between nuclear technology and artificial intelligence. And what I thought was really interesting, what the move, so to speak, that you've done is not just to show how dangerous hype can be, but also what happens if we're too critical about an application, for example. Where is the tipping point where we say we don't want to be too critical, because like then there are these negative consequences that we have to think about as well. So I was wondering whether you could talk us maybe through what risks there are, for example, in resisting too much. How do we know where the right line of resistance lies here?
Thank you so much. Yeah, and it's been really interesting hearing the other speakers sort of expand on their essays in the book, because I think there are so many parallels that speak to resistance as well. So yeah, I mean, in brief, the argument I make in my essay is that if you look at almost any technology, especially those that have emerged in recent kind of decades in recent history, the way that technology is developed, designed, deployed, used, funded, regulated, all of that is very much intertwined with public opinion, and particularly public resistance to those technologies. And as you said, I draw the parallel with nuclear power. Over the past 60, 70 years, there's a quite strong correlation between times when nations have stopped investing in nuclear power and times when public resistance to nuclear power has been relatively high. And obviously that's come following, particularly the disasters of Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, Fukushima, and so on. So that correlation between resistance and the lack of interest, political willpower, investment in a technology is quite strong. But it's not just with nuclear power. We see that correlation and that interplay with other technologies as well. So public resistance to genetically modified crops, for example, had a really huge effect on how and where they've been adopted all around the world. And even mundane technologies like cars, when cars were first developed and put on the roads, there was this huge moral panic about how safe they were and how dangerous they were, and that eventually drove to innovations like road markings and seat belts and all these kind of innovations that came. So essentially almost any technology is shaped by public opinion and public resistance. And I guess the parallel I draw is that a similar thing is the case with AI technologies, and where AI technologies are harmful. And we've heard about a lot of the harms that AI technologies can create earlier in the panel, those harms will be resisted, rightly so. And that resistance will then make it harder to get the political willpower to support the good technologies that might fall out of AI, or it'll mean that consumers choose different products and services because they're concerned about the AI that underpins them. And we're seeing this, in real life already. In the UK, the students protesting the A-level algorithm because it caused harms, and then the government causing a pretty quick U-turn on the use of that technology. And I bet you there'll be quite a lot of hesitation before algorithms like that are deployed again. And even just recently, I saw something. One of the directors of Palantir, this big AI firm, was saying how hard it is for their company at the moment to grow in Europe because there's so much resistance to the practices that they deploy. So we're seeing the effect of this resistance already. And yes, it is absolutely true that there are risks to that resistance. If fear of AI, if resistance to AI stifles all development in artificial intelligence, then we'll miss out on the good stuff as well. So, if people are concerned about AI and that means they decide not to share their health data, for example, then it'll make it really hard to develop AI technologies in health that can discover new medicines and improve treatments and all those kind of things. But I think the other part of my argument that I'm trying to make is that resistance isn't a bad thing. It's a really important thing, and actually it's kind of the flip side of hype, and because it's a really important signal for when technologies are being used well or not. If a technology is being used responsibly, ethically, if it's benefiting people, it won't be resisted. If it's being used harmfully, it will be resisted. And I think Tulsi and Aparna and Favor have spoken quite eloquently about how harmful technologies do get resisted or should get resisted. So yes, resistance may stifle kind of genuinely good harmful technologies, but it can also signpost the harmful AI too, and it's really important for that. And public resistance to technology, I think, is kind of natural and necessary, and so we shouldn't dismiss resistance to technology as kind of, oh, it's they're new Luddites, or it's people who have an irrational fear of robots and they don't know anything. Really what we need to do is recognize resistance for what it is. It's a really, really powerful signal that new technologies like AI and the practices that underpin them and the organizations involved in developing and deploying them all of that might be misaligned with the views and the values and the needs of the public in this country and around the world. So I guess one of the things I was thinking about actually when Gemma was speaking was that maybe resistance is kind of the flip side of hype. And I haven't thought this through, but maybe there's some kind of balance between resistance and hype, and kind of maybe there's a sweet spot between the two, where if you balance kind of the hype around a technology and the resistance to that technology, maybe you end up with the kind of genuinely good, societally beneficial technology. But maybe that's a question for other people to pick up on. I guess that the main thing I want to say is that the real risk in relation to resistance is if we ignore public resistance to technologies like AI, then the real risk is that the harms will proliferate.
Aidan, that's absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. And I like this idea of, is resistance the flip side of hype? And maybe we can think about this a little bit more, with drawing on the other panelists as well, because Ryan, if I mispronounce your name, I'm particularly sorry about this, but also ask a question around maybe getting us to the point of like, what is that sweet spot when we think around what the benefits and the drawbacks, the risks and the benefits are. And the question here is in particular, if we have certain benefits, for example, of algorithms, in relation to predicting, for example, economic behavior or markets, even though that they have to collect a lot of different data, which can be very invasive and in some capacity maybe even going against privacy. There are also some good practices, obviously, around like knowing, being able to predict in some models, but also the concerns that we see. So having those two things in mind, how should we think about the benefits and the risks, for example, in relation to collecting data in a more economic behavior context? I will open this up to anyone who wants to answer this question.
Just very quickly, I think the reason why we wrote this book and worked on this project is to say the famous coffee or tea, yes, please. I think the most important thing is to really question and interrogate the assumptions. A lot of time, the reflex is to frame any debate about technology as their risks and their benefits, and we need to balance them out. That may be true, it is true in many instances, but there are also instances where there actually are no benefits, or where the risks are actually really low. And I think putting the human rights hat on, we constantly, there are rights that are absolute, but there are also rights that are always balanced out. So there is no absolute right to privacy. We constantly negotiate these things. This is not unique to technology. So my reflex is always to say, let's get out of this mindset. It's hardly ever a constructive debate about technology when we frame a question in terms of what are the risks, what are the benefits.
Friederike, thank you so much. Maybe somebody else who wants to come in while I'm trying to scan the other longer questions.
I can also answer to that a little bit.
Please, Aparna.
I really like Aidan's framing of resistance versus hype. And this answers back to your question that you posed as well, which is, I think maybe that balance there is critical consideration, because that is the way we need to find a way to not look at it as a trade-off, but really find that middle path of careful consideration. And one more thing to consider, again, the way to balance those benefits and risks is also to make the distinction between an experiment, creating an AI to see if this can potentially solve something. Yes, it's exciting, and test it in a lab. Where it gets problematic is when it's just brought out from the lab, implemented in society, experimented on real people in real life conditions without the necessarily checks and balances. Even if you had to do it as an experiment, there are ways to then look at the impact that it has, and that requires that has to be very intentional, because you might not see the impacts. It's often hidden. It often affects vulnerable and marginalized communities more. So I think that, in terms of concrete actions, that means it can't just be tech teams rolling out experiments into society. There's a very strong argument to be made to have social scientists and designers and researchers in that process, because that skill set does exist, and it does exist within technology, but these teams tend to be quite narrow. So yeah, I guess these were just the two responses I had.
Aparna, thank you so much. Aidan, I think that the resistance question has definitely struck a note here, because the other question is around this idea of what are the spaces in which you resist? How do you know what you're resisting? What are some practical steps, so to speak, that we could think of in order where, you obviously have to know that you're impacted by it, that you're actually a stakeholder in it, then you have to know what to do. You obviously gave some examples, and Aparna Tulsi, your article was an example where the farmers have said, okay, we are at the receiving end of this, we are going to protest, this is what resistance is going to look like. They've obviously, in your case, it would be thinking through how can people really resist what we are seeing in Nigeria. And Friederike and Gemma, my question to you would be then, how do you see resistance when you really take a step back and say, all of me as data, for example, or hype that we see in general? What is it that I can do to resist the hype that you were talking about? Any one of you who wants to pick this up?
I can go for that one. I think there's some really interesting forms of resistance that we're seeing now. Obviously, there's the kind of more traditional form of protest in person out in front of Parliament, or in our case, in the farmers in New Delhi. That's one piece, but I've seen some really interesting artistic using art as protest. And so there was, I think it was the Feminist Internet that recently published a video that was around how do young people envision their future with AI. And it was a piece of protest, essentially, around this kind of dystopian future that young people are now seeing themselves as potentially having. And it was this beautiful piece of art, and at least in my circles that was being shared, and that was another way that you could go about doing that. And then a third way that is maybe more action oriented, that we've seen even with the farmers, for example, was actually boycotting some of those technologies. And so the farmers, for example, stopped using the cell phone plans that were made by the big corporate that they were fighting against. We've seen a large group of people migrate from WhatsApp onto Signal, because they disagree with that particular platform. Now that's a privilege that not everybody has, but that would be another way of resisting.
Something I was just thinking about as well, to add to your list, Tulsi, is and something I've been quite interested in is the workers too, right? So the question that was put in the chat from Kira is about users, but I think what's been quite interesting to witness and to follow has been particularly in Silicon Valley, the kind of nexus of where a lot of these technologies are being created at the end of the day. There are coalitions, tech worker coalitions, the rise of tech worker unions, and even just the discourse around organizing, not as blue collar workers, but as white collar, wealthier, being seen as a worker, if that makes sense. And I think that's kind of interesting too, from a cultural standpoint. I would say it used to be pretty cool to work at Facebook, and now people maybe don't really want to say that they work at Facebook. So you're seeing these cultural shifts in terms of how people are perceiving technology. And I mean, the tech lash has a lot to do with that in terms of coverage, but I think resistance, it can also be a sort of quiet resistance, not congratulating your pal on getting a job at Google maybe is an example, or at least not thinking of it as quite so cool as it used to be. There's small things that culturally actually, and Aidan talks about this a lot, can have huge impact in terms of how people operate, and workers have, as we know from history, a huge amount of power when you have a level of coordination. So that's certainly a world that I'm following quite closely.
Brilliant. Gemma, Aidan, did you want to respond, or did you?
Just quickly pick up on the last thing Gemma said, the word power,
Absolutely.
which I think is so important. And I completely agree. I really like, quiet resistance of kind of not congratulating your colleague who gets a job at a questionable organization, through to like loud resistance, which is holding the placard and protesting. And then, resistance in the middle, which is consumer choices. Which technology companies do you want to give your attention or your money to? But I think wrapped up in all of this and running throughout it is this question of power, and what power do people have? Most people that are affected by AI don't have the power to change the code that the AI runs on, or the power to choose where it's deployed. So this question of power, who has the power to shape where technologies are made and deployed, and who is disempowered or affected by these technologies, and how can resistance help shift that balance? And protest is one, consumer choice is one, but this question of power is really tied up as well, and a really interesting one that I probably don't know enough about to continue talking about.
Aidan, thank you so much for adding this. And I've obviously seen Joanna's question around how do we see resistance? Okay, it just left. In terms of regulation, that's obviously a very big question. If anyone wants to stay a couple of more minutes to think about the question of how to regulate artificial intelligence, I invite you all to stay. However, being mindful of the time and everybody else having different meetings and things to attend to, I wanted to take this opportunity to thank all of our panelists today who have put together a most outstanding book and have given their time today to talk you all through these very important topics. Do get the book, download it, buy it, get it, read it, recommend it, share it. I wanted to thank all of you so much. Colm and Isabel, thank you so much also to the Oxford Internet Institute, and thank you all so much for taking your time today to think with us through the rise and fall of AI, its hype, its possibilities, and its risks. So thank thank you all so much. And I wish you all a wonderful day for those of you who are leaving, for those of you who want to stay a couple more minutes to think about something else, then do stay. If not, have a wonderful time today. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Just so you know, Christine, the question from Joanne is in the answered panel, so you can still see
Did
it.
you? Yes. Okay. Friederike, have you just gone ahead and said you're not happy about regulation? Okay, great.
No, I think, again, like, this is why I find this framing, the question was, does it strike the right balance? And I think that's precisely what the regulation tries. It tries to strike a balance between innovation and risk. Where it's too weak, it's places where maybe AI actually just shouldn't be used at all, where there maybe shouldn't be a bias. And it's also, as a result, it tries to strike a balance. So the regulation is so complicated that I also, coming from the innovation perspective, it will be quite difficult to comply with and to enforce. So it's not good enough, but it's also really complicated, and in its current form, it really needs to be improved. Precisely because it tries to strike a balance, would be my argument.
I think it's a very interesting take. I was wondering whether anyone else wanted to add anything on the very complex and big topic of regulation, but just leave us with a final thought, a way of thinking about it. Obviously not putting too much pressure on you, but Gemma, did you want to add maybe a final thought for us? Yeah.
Oh gosh, the pressure of a final thought. I'm not an expert on the EU regulatory proposal, and that's definitely more Friederike's area, but just something I think Friederike kind of touched on this idea earlier on, and I think is important to keep bringing back, that when we think about how to regulate AI, a lot of the time you're also thinking about how to regulate technology more generally, and then actually you're also trying to think about, well, what action is okay as human beings. And I think sometimes we can forget that actually you're trying to sometimes solve problems that ethically we haven't been able to solve, or we already do have solutions for in law. So like an example would be, the trolley problem is always brought up as a, what do we do in terms of how do we pick? And it's like, well, this is in health regulation already, because doctors have to make decisions like this all the time. So I think sometimes there's a exceptionalism around technology, particularly around technologies like AI, that really we have to work to try and pull back and be like, what is the sort of human problem that we're facing here, and look to other spaces to be like, how have we wrestled or not wrestled with this in the past, and what does that say about the society in which you're asking that question, as opposed to just going, what are the pros and cons, or how do we balance with this very particular kind of technology. That's always what I try and do when I'm trying to think through these questions, I suppose.
Great, fabulous. Well, then on the note of rethinking conceptually, what is it that we're trying to achieve when trying to achieve balance, and what is it when we think about what are the implications of thinking how exceptional technology is, or in fact is not, leaving you all with these interesting, complex, challenging, and yet very necessary thoughts. Thank you again all so much to our panelists, and do get the book. It is open access. Yes, thank you all so much. And then I hope we'll be seeing each other very soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christine. And thank you all for coming and joining and listening. Have a good evening. Bye.